So I have to make the decision on my own that it's time for me to move on. They wanted to do a retro movie. I don't like that. Every movie I worked very hard to make them different.
George Lucas. The name itself has become a symbol of cinematic imagination, innovation, and storytelling on a scale few others could ever match. For millions of people across the world, he isn't just a filmmaker. He's the man who gave us an entire universe to get lost in. Star Wars wasn't just a film series. It was a cultural earthquake, reshaping everything from the way movies were made to the way they were marketed, distributed, and remembered. It turned science fiction into a mainstream powerhouse and made characters like Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader, and Princess Leia into household names. But while Lucas has been celebrated as a genius storyteller and a pioneer in special effects, the real story behind his galaxy far, far away is more complicated. Because behind the groundbreaking visuals and billion-dollar franchise were very human clashes, conflicts between a perfectionist visionary and the actors who gave his creations flesh, blood, and voice. This isn't just about petty gossip from a film set. It's about the fascinating, sometimes tense collision between art and commerce, ego and vision, innovation and tradition. When we talk about Star Wars, it's easy to get lost in the spectacle, the spaceships, the duels, the explosions. But what's often forgotten is how those iconic moments were shaped by relationships behind the camera. And those relationships weren't always easy. Some actors adored Lucas, while others found him cold, distant, and difficult to work with. It was, at its core, the struggle of collaboration. How much room does an actor have to bring their own artistry when the director has already built the world in his head, down to the smallest detail? To understand these conflicts, we need to step back and look at the man himself. George Walton Lucas Jr. was born in 1944 in Modesto, California. Unlike many of his Hollywood contemporaries, he didn't grow up dreaming of the stage. He was fascinated by speed, adventure, and the thrill of storytelling. As a teenager, he loved cars. He even thought about becoming a professional race car driver before a near-fatal crash forced him to rethink his path. Instead, he channeled that hunger for adrenaline and spectacle into film. Studying at USC's School of Cinematic Arts, Lucas quickly became the kind of filmmaker who wasn't satisfied with telling stories the traditional way. He wanted to bend the medium itself, to test the limits of sound, visuals, and editing in ways others hadn't imagined. Before Star Wars, Lucas found success with American Graffiti, a nostalgic look at teenage life in small-town America. The film was a hit, both critically and commercially, and it gave Lucas the credibility to pursue his true passion project. But Star Wars wasn't just a movie idea, it was a vision. He imagined a sprawling space opera inspired by the adventure serials of his childhood, mythology, and Joseph Campbell's theories of the hero's journey. Where other filmmakers might have settled for what was possible, Lucas obsessed over what could be invented. He founded Industrial Light and Magic to pioneer new special effects, pushed for new methods of sound design, and even revolutionized how films were distributed by securing the sequel and merchandising rights that would make him one of the most powerful figures in Hollywood. But here's the catch. While Lucas was busy reshaping the very foundations of modern cinema, he wasn't particularly interested in the nuances of performance. He was not what you'd call an actor's director. He rarely gave detailed feedback, and when he did, it was often vague. His most famous note on set was simply, "Faster, more intense." For actors trained in the art of character work, this could be frustrating, even alienating. Lucas wasn't trying to be cruel or dismissive. His mind just worked differently. He was constantly juggling camera angles, storyboards, effect shots, and technical details. For him, actors were just one component of a much larger puzzle, and their job was to fit seamlessly into the grand vision. Running a massive production like Star Wars required an iron grip on the process. Lucas storyboarded sequences down to the smallest shot, leaving little room for improvisation. Every line, every move, every gesture was calculated to serve the rhythm of the larger story. And while that precision created cinematic history, it also left some performers feeling boxed in. They weren't collaborators, they were at times more like chess pieces on Lucas's galactic board. For some actors, that worked just fine. They thrived under his structured vision. But for others, it was stifling. This dynamic, visionary control versus artistic freedom, sets the stage for the conflicts that unfolded behind the scenes. Because when you're dealing with actors, you're not just working with bodies delivering lines. You're working with egos, emotions, and creative instincts. And when those instincts collide with the director's ironclad vision, sparks inevitably fly. So what happens when the man who dreamed up a galaxy far, far away clashes with the very people who made that dream come alive? What happens when Lucas's perfectionist drive runs headfirst into actors who want recognition, respect, or just a little more freedom on set? That's where things get fascinating, and sometimes a little messy, and nowhere is that tension clearer than in the story of the man who wore the most iconic mask in film history. Darth Vader's towering silhouette may have terrified audiences, but the actor inside that suit carried his own private battles, ones that would leave scars lasting long after the cameras stopped rolling. When you think of Darth Vader, certain images come immediately to mind: the black helmet gleaming under harsh lights, the mechanical breathing that sends chills down your spine, the sheer size and presence of a figure who dominates every scene he steps into. Vader wasn't just a villain. He became one of cinema's most enduring icons, a character who could silence a room with a single entrance. But behind that imposing armor wasn't a faceless machine. It was a man named David Prowse, a former bodybuilder and actor whose powerful frame gave Vader his unforgettable silhouette, and for all the fear Vader struck in audiences. Prowse's own journey with the role was far more complicated and ultimately heartbreaking. David Prowse was, in many ways, the perfect choice to embody the Dark Lord of the Sith. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with a body honed by years of bodybuilding competitions and even stints training actors for physical roles, he was a man built to command attention. George Lucas needed someone who could physically dominate the screen, someone whose movements alone would suggest menace and power. Prowse fit that mold flawlessly. His deliberate, methodical performance gave Vader the chilling presence we now take for granted, and without his physical contribution, the character simply wouldn't have worked. But from the very beginning, a fracture was built into Vader's legacy. While Prowse provided the body, the voice, the part of an actor that connects most directly with the audience, was taken away from him. Lucas decided that Prowse's natural West Country English accent didn't carry the gravitas or menace needed for the role. Instead, he brought in James Earl Jones, whose deep, resonant tones created one of the most iconic voices in film history. From a creative standpoint, it made perfect sense. Jones's voice and Prowse's physicality together created a villain unlike anything audiences had ever seen. But for Prowse himself, it was a devastating blow. He felt sidelined, stripped of his ownership of the character he had embodied so completely. To give your body to a role and then have your voice, the essence of your performance, replaced, left him feeling like a ghost inside the suit. The tension only grew as production continued. Prowse later claimed he wasn't even told that his voice would be dubbed until after filming was completed. Imagine spending months pouring yourself into a role, only to discover in the theater that your voice had been erased. For Prowse, it wasn't just about creative choices. It was about recognition. Darth Vader was destined to become one of the most famous villains of all time. But the man inside the mask found himself increasingly invisible. To the public, Vader was James Earl Jones's voice. To the filmmakers, he was one part of a larger machine. And to Prowse himself, he was being erased from the history he had helped create. Adding fuel to the fire were issues of communication and trust. Lucas and his production team were notoriously secretive about the plot of Star Wars, guarding twists and reveals with almost obsessive caution. Prowse, however, sometimes found himself blamed when spoilers leaked, whether or not he was responsible. The most famous case involved the shocking revelation that Vader was Luke Skywalker's father. Prowse had supposedly hinted at major plot points in interviews, something Lucasfilm considered unforgivable. To them, it looked like carelessness. To Prowse, it felt like scapegoating. He insisted that much of the controversy was exaggerated, but the damage was done. By the time the original trilogy was complete, Prowse's relationship with Lucas and Lucasfilm had soured badly. The final straw came years later, in 2010, when Lucasfilm reportedly banned him from attending official Star Wars conventions. For someone who had literally worn the suit of the saga's most iconic figure, this was a crushing blow. Fans adored him, lining up at independent conventions to meet the man who had brought Vader to life, but the official franchise seemed determined to keep him at arm's length. To Prowse, it must have felt like being erased not only from the films, but from the community that celebrated them. And yet, despite all of this, David Prowse never stopped embracing the fans. He spent decades attending conventions, signing autographs, and telling stories about his time on set. For many fans, meeting him was as close as they could get to meeting Vader himself. He leaned into that connection, often with humor and warmth, showing that beneath the dark armor was a man who genuinely cared about the people who loved the character. He even wrote an autobiography, candidly detailing his experiences and frustrations, offering his side of a story that too often left him in the shadows. What Prowse's story reveals is something deeper about George Lucas's directing style and priorities. Lucas wasn't trying to be cruel. He was focused on creating the most effective end product possible. In his mind, the voice and the body were two separate tools, and combining them gave him the perfect villain. But filmmaking isn't just about results, it's about people. And in prioritizing his vision, Lucas sometimes overlooked the emotional needs of the actors who brought that vision to life. For Prowse, that meant living in the strange in-between, forever associated with Vader, but never fully recognized as him. In a way, it's a perfect example of the paradox of filmmaking. Characters like Darth Vader become larger than life, bigger than any one person, yet they're built from the contributions of many. Prowse's body, Jones's voice, the stunt doubles who performed the duels, all of them together created Vader. But when the history books are written, not everyone gets equal credit. Some names shine brightly, while others fade into the shadows. Prowse's story is a reminder that behind even the most legendary roles are real human beings with pride, disappointment, and resilience. For all the complications, his legacy is undeniable. No one else could have given Vader that terrifying presence. No one else could have moved with that deliberate menace. Without David Prowse, Darth Vader simply wouldn't have been Darth Vader. And though his relationship with Lucas was fraught with tension, his contribution to the saga remains unforgettable. But what happens when the actor isn't a bodybuilder looking for recognition, but an Oscar-winning stage veteran, a man steeped in Shakespearean tradition, suddenly thrust into a galaxy of robots and laser swords? The next story takes us from hurt feelings to outright disillusionment, as we look at the complicated legacy of Alec Guinness, the man who gave Obi-Wan Kenobi his timeless gravitas. If David Prowse represented the physical muscle behind Star Wars, Alec Guinness embodied its soul. His performance as Obi-Wan Kenobi gave the saga its first true anchor, a figure of wisdom and gravitas who grounded a wild, imaginative space adventure in something recognizable, something human. Without Guinness, Star Wars might have been seen as a charming curiosity, a kid's adventure filled with robots and flashy visuals. With him, it became mythic. He was the wise mentor, the sage whose calm authority lent weight to every scene. And yet, for all his importance to the story, Guinness himself was deeply conflicted about his role. His relationship with George Lucas and the galaxy far, far away was one marked by frustration, skepticism, and a desire to escape the very thing that brought him global fame. Long before he ever picked up a lightsaber, Alec Guinness was already a towering figure in the world of acting. Born in 1914, he built his career on the stage, mastering Shakespeare and earning respect as one of Britain's finest performers. By the time Lucas cast him in Star Wars, Guinness had an Academy Award to his name for The Bridge on the River Kwai, along with countless acclaimed performances in film and theater. To put it simply, he was a serious actor, steeped in tradition, with decades of experience commanding respect on screen and off. For Lucas, casting Guinness was a stroke of genius. He needed someone with the authority to make Obi-Wan Kenobi more than just another character. He needed him to be the emotional spine of the story. But Guinness wasn't convinced. From the start, he was skeptical about the project. Science fiction wasn't his world. and the script itself, with its strange names, odd dialogue, and space-age jargon, often struck him as absurd. He privately referred to much of the dialogue as mumbo-jumbo, struggling to take it seriously. Lines that have since become iconic, discussions about the Force, the Jedi, or lightsabers, were to Guinness often clunky and unconvincing. As a classically trained actor, he valued nuance, rhythm, and elegance in language. Star Wars, with its pulpy style, didn't give him that. His frustrations didn't end with the dialogue. Like Prowse, Guinness found Lucas's directing style difficult to navigate. Lucas wasn't an actor's director. He didn't provide deep analysis or emotional guidance, preferring instead to focus on technical aspects. His famous, faster, more intense direction was of little use to someone of Guinness's caliber who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of subtlety and craft. To Guinness, it often felt as if Lucas was more interested in the spectacle, the special effects, the groundbreaking visuals than in the human performances that gave the film its heart. And yet, despite these reservations, Guinness delivered a performance that elevated the entire film. His Obi-Wan wasn't just a character. He was a mythological archetype, a modern-day Merlin guiding the young hero on his journey. When Obi-Wan speaks about the Force, audiences believe him, not because of the words on the page, but because of the weight Guinness brought to them. He imbued Lucas's sometimes awkward lines with gravitas, transforming them into something timeless. Without Guinness, the Force might have sounded like a gimmick. With him, it became the beating heart of the saga. But for Guinness, the cost was high. He reportedly grew tired of the constant attention the role brought him. Fans adored him, but he often felt trapped by their obsession. Letters poured in, fans stopped him on the street, and everywhere he went, Obi-Wan followed. For a man who had spent decades cultivating a career defined by variety and artistic respect, it was frustrating to be suddenly defined by one role in a space fantasy he had once dismissed. At times, he even seemed resentful of the fans themselves. In one infamous story, Guinness claimed he once told a young admirer that if he recited a certain line of dialogue, it would be the last time he ever did so. It wasn't that he hated the fans. It was that the intensity of their devotion was overwhelming, and he struggled to reconcile it with his own feelings about the work. Perhaps that's why Guinness lobbied for Obi-Wan's early exit from the saga. According to multiple accounts, he pushed Lucas to have his character killed off in the first film. Part of it was artistic. It gave the story a powerful emotional twist. But part of it was practical. Guinness wanted out. He didn't want to be tied to a franchise he didn't fully believe in or locked into the same role for years to come. By allowing Obi-Wan to die in A New Hope, Guinness freed himself from the long-term obligations of sequels while still leaving behind one of the most memorable moments in cinematic history. And yet, despite his frustrations, Guinness's contribution can't be overstated. His Obi-Wan provided the foundation for every Jedi that came after. He gave the saga a sense of weight and legitimacy that no amount of special effects could provide. Even Lucas acknowledged that Guinness's presence lent the film a credibility it might otherwise have lacked. In this sense, their relationship was complicated. Lucas needed Guinness to elevate the material, but Guinness never fully embraced Lucas's vision. It was a creative partnership built on necessity, not mutual passion. Over time, Guinness softened his stance. In later interviews, he acknowledged the cultural impact of Star Wars and expressed some pride in the joy it brought to audiences. He couldn't ignore the way it had reshaped popular culture, even if he personally found the experience challenging. Still, his story highlights a fundamental truth about filmmaking. When tradition meets innovation, sparks fly. Lucas was building the future of cinema, while Guinness was rooted in the traditions of the past. Their collaboration produced magic on screen. But off-screen it revealed the tensions that arise when two very different artistic philosophies collide. Ultimately, Alec Guinness's legacy within Star Wars is as complex as the man himself. To audiences, he will always be Obi-Wan Kenobi, the wise mentor who introduced them to the Force. To Lucas, he was the actor who gave his story the gravitas it needed, even if he never quite believed in it himself. And to Guinness, it was both a blessing and a burden, a role that immortalized him in pop culture. even as it left him longing for the artistic freedom of his earlier career. So while David Prowse's story is one of invisibility and exclusion, Guinness's is one of reluctant participation, an artist who gave more to a role than he received in return, and who struggled to accept the fame that followed. Together, their experiences reveal the two sides of George Lucas's filmmaking: visionary spectacle that changed the world, and a directing style that sometimes left the people behind the performances feeling overlooked, frustrated, or misunderstood. But the story doesn't end there, because the legacy of George Lucas isn't just about individual conflicts. It's about what those conflicts tell us about filmmaking itself: the balance between vision and collaboration, technology and humanity, myth and reality. And in the final reflection, we'll see how these stories fit together to paint a portrait of a man whose genius reshaped cinema, even as it left complicated scars on those who worked alongside him. Looking back on the stories of David Prowse and Alec Guinness, it's clear that George Lucas's brilliance as a filmmaker was both his greatest strength and his greatest source of conflict. He was a man with a singular vision, someone who could imagine entire galaxies in his mind and then will them into existence through sheer determination. He revolutionized special effects, redefined sound design, and created one of the most successful film franchises in history. But in doing so, he sometimes overlooked the very people who brought his vision to life. For Lucas, movies were machines built with precision, every part carefully designed to serve the larger whole. For the actors, though, those machines sometimes felt like cages, limiting their ability to explore, improvise, or leave their personal mark on the story. This clash between visionary control and human collaboration lies at the heart of the Star Wars saga, not on screen, but behind it. David Prowse felt invisible, his body used but his voice erased. Alec Guinness felt trapped, his talent celebrated but confined to a role he didn't fully respect. And while their experiences were different, both reveal a similar truth. Lucas's relentless focus on the end product often came at the expense of nurturing the actors themselves. His genius was undeniable, but it wasn't always easy to work with. Of course, none of this diminishes the legacy Lucas created. In fact, these very tensions may have been part of what made Star Wars so unique. Lucas wasn't interested in making a film the way others did. He didn't chase the conventional wisdom of Hollywood or bend to the comfort of his cast. He was building something bigger than any one actor, bigger than any single performance. He was crafting a myth. And myths aren't always born in harmony. They're often forged in friction, in the push and pull between competing visions. When we watch Darth Vader stride onto the screen for the first time, most of us don't think about the man sweating inside the suit, feeling sidelined by the voice that replaced his own. When we hear Obi-Wan speak about the Force, we don't hear the inner sigh of a classically trained actor trying to make sense of lines he found clumsy. What we see is magic, what we feel is timeless. And maybe that's the paradox of filmmaking. The audience sees the finished miracle, but behind that miracle are very human struggles, disappointments and compromises. Yet, there's something deeply humanizing about these behind-the-scenes stories. They remind us that even in the most legendary projects, ego, pride, and frustration play a role. That even icons like Guinness and towering figures like Prowse wrestled with doubt, resentment, or a longing for recognition. It makes the saga more than just a story about heroes and villains in space. It becomes a story about artists, flawed and brilliant, trying to find their place in something larger than themselves. And Lucas? His story is equally complex. To some, he was a cold perfectionist, more interested in models and sound effects than people. To others, he was a visionary who gave his collaborators the opportunity to be part of something bigger than cinema itself. Both are true. He may not have been warm or collaborative in the traditional sense, but without his unwavering determination, Star Wars would never have existed. He was a dreamer who demanded the impossible, and then found ways to make it real. In the decades since, Star Wars has grown into a cultural phenomenon unlike any other. Children who grew up watching Obi-Wan teach Luke about the Force are now parents, passing the same stories down to their own kids. Darth Vader, once just a villain on a movie poster, has become a symbol recognized in every corner of the globe. And through it all, the legacies of the actors and the director remain intertwined. Prowse may have felt invisible, but fans never forgot the man in the suit. Guinness may have felt trapped, but his Obi-Wan became the blueprint for every Jedi that followed. And Lucas, despite the conflicts, remains the architect of it all, the man who dared to imagine and refused to compromise. So what do we take away from these stories? Perhaps it's this: creativity is never simple. It isn't clean, it isn't easy, and it doesn't always leave everyone satisfied. Sometimes the pursuit of perfection means others feel left behind. Sometimes the greatest achievements come with personal sacrifices, disagreements, and scars. And yet those very struggles are what make the final product so powerful. Without the tension, without the push and pull, maybe Star Wars wouldn't have become what it is today. In the end, the legacy of George Lucas isn't just about spaceships, lightsabers, or billion-dollar franchises. It's about the messy, complicated, deeply human process of bringing a vision to life. It's about how genius and frustration often live side by side. And it's about how the work of countless individuals, some celebrated, some overlooked, can combine to create something that outlives them all. So the next time you watch Star Wars and hear Obi-Wan's calm wisdom, or feel a chill as Darth Vader enters a room, remember the people behind the magic. Remember David Prowse, sweating in that heavy costume, fighting for recognition. Remember Alec Guinness, struggling with dialogue he didn't respect, yet delivering it with such conviction that it became myth. And remember George Lucas, the dreamer who built it all, even if his way of working left cracks along the edges. Because that's the real story of Star Wars. Not just the galaxy far, far away, but the very human battles fought right here on Earth. The clashes of ego, vision, and artistry that turned one man's dream into a legend. And like the saga itself, those stories will be remembered for generations to come.